Before there was freedom, there was distance, a vast ocean between the rulers and the ruled. Across that water, 13 small colonies began to stir. Farmers, merchants, dreamers, ordinary people, discovering that endurance can become independence, and whispers can turn into revolution. This is the story of how a quiet land found its voice, and how that voice changed the world. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let's drift back to the beginning, to the moment history began to wake. If you enjoy stories that teach and help you unwind, please subscribe and join us on this gentle journey through the past. Before there was revolution, there was rhythm. The slow rhythm of seasons turning, of plows cutting through damp soil, of bells ringing across small towns that dotted a vast green continent. Each colony had its own heartbeat. In New England, the mornings smelled of salt and pine. Fishermen set out before dawn, their small boats gliding across misty harbors, lanterns flickering like grounded stars. The villages were close-knit, white-steepled churches, meeting houses, and tidy squares where voices carried in the crisp air. Further south, the soil darkened and the days grew long and humid. Great fields of tobacco and rice waved beneath the far. The plantations were wide and ordered, but behind that order were human hands, enslaved men and women whose songs floated through the fields like echoes of another homeland. Between them lay the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, fertile and bustling. Markets smelled of bread and wool and iron. Farmers brought grain by wagon into towns where printers' shops spilled out pamphlets and gossip. Life in the colonies was not easy, but it was full. Families rose before light. Children fetched water from wells rimmed with frost. Mothers mended clothes by firelight. Fathers repaired fences, traded goods, wrote letters home to England that might never arrive. There was distance in every direction, distance from the next town, from the next world, from the crown across the sea. But there was also a sense of possibility. In taverns and meeting houses, talk flowed like cider. Farmers and merchants discussed harvests and politics in equal measure. There was a belief, quiet, almost unspoken, that people here could shape their own fate. Each colony had been born for a reason. Some, like Massachusetts or Rhode Island, for faith. Others, like Virginia and the Carolinas, for fortune. Pennsylvania, with its Quaker calm, promised tolerance. Georgia began as a hopeful experiment in fairness and reform. But no matter their differences, all were bound by the Atlantic, a silver thread connecting them to an empire of kings, taxes, and tea. Ships brought glass and lace and letters stamped with red wax. In return went timber, tobacco, and indigo. The colonies were both loyal and restless children. They sang English songs, swore English oaths, read English books, but they were beginning to dream in another language, one they had yet to invent. In New England, schoolhouses taught Latin and scripture beside stories of native legends. In the South, planters' sons studied abroad, while daughters learned music and the fine art of conversation. In cities like Philadelphia, ideas thrived. The air buzzed with invention. Ben Franklin's printing press, his lightning rods, his experiments with kites and keys. Coffee houses became the beating heart of conversation. Candles guttered as arguments flared about science, faith, and freedom. The colonies were alive with curiosity, and yet beneath that hum of daily life, there was a growing awareness, an almost spiritual restlessness. The people here were thousands of miles from their king, governed by men they would never meet. They obeyed laws written in a room they'd never seen. To a farmer in Massachusetts, the crown was a symbol stamped on coins, distant and untouchable. To a merchant in Charleston, it was a tariff that made business harder. To an enslaved man on a plantation, it was both everything and nothing, the name of a power that never saw his face. Still, few spoke of rebellion. Life was about endurance, not revolution. They endured winters that split trees in half, summers that turned rivers dry, and a world where illness arrived without warning. But endurance has a way of teaching independence. Each time a colonist built a fence or cleared a field, or bargained in a local court, he learned a small truth, that the world could be managed without a king's hand guiding it. And then came the stories. Travelers brought them from colony to colony, of governors arguing, with assemblies of new taxes, of whispered injustices. These were small things at first, a law here, a protest there. But each story planted a seed, and those seeds began to take root. When a Boston printer published a sermon on liberty, it found its way to Philadelphia. When a Virginia preacher spoke against tyranny, his words were repeated in a New York tavern weeks later. The colonies were learning to listen to each other. The rivers carried not just goods but ideas. Still, life went on. Children were born. Fields were plowed. Bells rang out on Sundays. No one yet knew that these same bells would one day ring for war, or that the prayers whispered beneath church rafters would turn into cries for independence. For now, the colonies slept beneath a wide, restless sky. At night, the fires burned low, and people told stories to keep away the dark. Stories of wolves, of native spirits, of distant kings. But somewhere in those flickering shadows, a new story was beginning. A story of ordinary people who would find an extraordinary voice. A merchant counting coins, a farmer mending a fence, a woman writing a letter by candlelight. They were the first whispers of a chorus that would soon grow too loud to ignore. The world around them was changing, the forests receding, the towns growing. And with every passing year, the colonies were less like England and more like themselves. Imagine it. A moon rising over the Atlantic, ships rocking gently at anchor, the scent of pine and smoke in the air. A continent sleeping, yet stirring, beneath. That quiet surface, something fragile and immense was taking shape. An identity, an idea, a nation not yet born but already breathing. No one could see it clearly. Not yet. But history, like the tide, was already moving in their direction. The Atlantic was once a promise, a vast blue space that connected two worlds. But by the middle of the 18th century, that ocean had begun to feel less like a bridge and more like a chain. Across the sea, Britain was changing. The 7 Years' War, what colonists called the French and Indian War, had left the empire proud but weary. Victorious, yes, but also deeply in debt. And when a great empire grows tired, it begins to look for ways to make its children pay for the victory. At first, the changes seemed harmless. A small tax on sugar, another on stamps. Simple words written in Parliament became quiet ripples in colonial life. The Sugar Act of 1764 meant to raise money for the crown, taxed molasses imported from the Caribbean. To the merchants of Boston, it was more than an inconvenience. It was a message. The empire would now reach into every barrel and ledger. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765. Every newspaper, every legal document, every deck of cards, even marriage, licenses, all required a stamp bearing the king's seal. In taverns and town halls, the complaints began softly. Not the shouts of revolution, not yet. Just weary sighs, furrowed brows, and muttered disbelief. Why should a man who's never seen my land decide what I pay upon it? One printer asked. Another replied, because he wears a crown. But soon the sighs turned into speeches. And in those speeches, something new stirred. A language of rights and representation, born not from rebellion, but reason. No taxation, without representation. It was not a cry of anger at first. It was a plea, a simple request to be heard. Colonists did not yet dream of breaking free. They still called themselves Englishmen. They simply wanted the same respect that distance had slowly taken away. Sound of rain on windows, muffled voices indoors. In the spring of 1765, protests spread quietly from colony to colony. The Stamp Act Congress gathered in New York, men of different regions, faiths, and fortunes sitting together for the first time. Their letters and petitions carried the same message. We are loyal, but we are not blind. The Parliament in London listened, frowned, and then relented, repealing the Stamp Act. but asserting its authority with the declaratory act. We can tax you anytime we wish. It was victory and warning, wrapped in the same parchment. In the years that followed, life in the colonies went on, but not quite as before. Every port, every shipment, every customs office now felt watched. The Townshend Acts of 1767 added more taxes on glass, paper, paint, and of course, tea. The resentment deepened, quiet but steady, like water seeping through stone. Boycotts began. In homes lit by candlelight, women spun homespun cloth instead of buying imported goods. Men signed non-importation agreements, pledging not to trade with Britain until fairness returned. Ordinary people became part of something larger, a slow, invisible unity. Letters traveled between the colonies, small notes of encouragement, shared outrage, and hope. Benjamin Franklin, across the sea in London, tried to reason with ministers who would not listen. He wrote with patience, not fury, reminding them that loyalty could not be bought with taxes. But distance distorted everything. To British eyes, the colonists seemed ungrateful children. To the colonists, Britain seemed an aging parent who no longer recognized their face. The taxes were small, but their shadow was enormous. Every teacup, every sheet of paper became a symbol of control, of principle, of pride. In Boston, Samuel Adams wrote essays in the Gazette describing the creeping reach of tyranny. In Virginia, Patrick Henry stood before the House of Burgesses and declared that liberty was worth any risk. And in Philadelphia, quiet Quakers spoke of conscience and equality, adding moral weight to political unrest. The colonies were awakening, not with fire, but with thought. They were beginning to see themselves not just as subjects, but as citizens. Each tax, each decree was another note in a growing symphony of independence, though no one yet dared to name it. Then came the moment that changed the tone. In 1770, on a cold March evening in Boston, a small crowd gathered in the square. Snow fell softly, muffling footsteps. British soldiers stood guard, red coats bright against the white world. Words were exchanged, harsh, angry, frightened words, and then a gunshot. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. The crowd scattered into the narrow streets, their cries echoing through the winter night. It would be called the Boston Massacre. But the true power of that night lay not in the bullets, but in the story that followed. Paul Revere engraved the scene, soldiers firing into a crowd, and it spread like wildfire across the colonies. The details blurred, emotions sharpened. What mattered now was not what had happened, but what it meant. To some, it was proof that the empire could no longer be trusted. To others, it was tragedy and misunderstanding. But no one could deny what was awakening beneath the grief, unity born of outrage and a hunger for dignity. Still, life went on. Merchants opened shops, families prayed, and ships unloaded tea under gray skies. But the peace had changed. It was no longer the peace of contentment, but the pause before decision. The taxes remained. Small coins, heavy with meaning. The tea still arrived, fragrant, bitter, and symbolic. And somewhere in that bitterness, history began to steep. The colonies were not yet united in rebellion, but the silence between them had broken. Through letters, boycotts, and shared grief, 13 voices were beginning to murmur the same words. Not yet freedom, but fairness. And fairness, once spoken, aloud cannot be unsaid. Boston, 1770. A small city pressed between sea and sky, full of ships, smoke, and restless talk. The harbor swelled with masts and sails. The taverns swelled with arguments. And through it all, the streets hummed with rumor. British soldiers walked in pairs, their red coats bright even beneath gray skies. They were meant to keep the peace, but peace is fragile when it's carried by strangers with muskets. It began with snow, cold March air, wet slush beneath boots. A boy shouted at a hewer, soldier outside the customs house, a childish taunt, the kind that fades in a heartbeat. But others heard, and they stopped to watch. More gathered. A handful became a crowd, words turned sharp. Snowballs flew, packed with bits of ice and ash. The soldiers raised their guns, their faces pale in the lantern light. Then, a sound. A crack like ice breaking on a river. A shot. Then another. When the smoke lifted, 5 lay still upon the stones. One of them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, the first to fall. The rest were shopkeepers, sailors, apprentices, ordinary souls who had not planned to die that night. The snow turned red beneath the flickering torches, and Boston fell silent. By morning, the story had already changed. It wasn't just an accident. It was a symbol. News spread faster than the tide. Pamphlets printed the word massacre in bold type, and the colonies whispered the same name from one end to the other. The power of the event wasn't in its numbers, but in its echo. In every coffee house, men leaned over tables and said, "Did you hear?" In every port, someone carried the story across the water, and in every home, mothers looked at their sons and wondered what kind of world they were growing up into. Samuel Adams knew the weight of words. He understood that a story told with feeling could move hearts faster than an army. He gathered witnesses, crafted letters, printed essays, each one shaping grief into resolve. And then came Paul Revere. With an engraver's careful hands, he carved the image that would live forever. Soldiers lined in formation, firing into a helpless crowd. He titled it simply, "The Bloody Massacre in King Street." It wasn't entirely accurate, but it didn't need to be. It was art in the service of belief. And when that print spread across the colonies, it did what bullets could not. It united minds. Across the ocean, Parliament dismissed it as colonial hysteria. But here, in America, the massacre became memory, and memory became meaning. The funerals were solemn, drums muffled, flags lowered. John Adams, though a patriot, defended the soldiers in court. He believed in fairness even when anger burned hottest. His voice was calm. "Facts are stubborn things," he said, and the jury listened. Most of the soldiers were acquitted. But the truth, the deeper truth, had already taken hold. The colonies had seen that British authority could bleed. That empire was not infallible. Afterward, Boston grew quieter, but not peaceful. Every tavern conversation felt heavier. Every law passed from London felt personal. The massacre had done something irreversible. It turned politics into emotion. And once hearts awaken, minds soon follow. Letters began to travel between towns faster than ever. Samuel Adams and others creating what they called committees of correspondence. They were simple networks, but powerful ones. Writers, letters, candles burning late into the night. Through them, Massachusetts spoke to Virginia, and Virginia to Pennsylvania. 13 voices, still scattered, began to harmonize in concern and defiance. Each colony felt its own injustice. But through those letters, they began to see that their struggles were not isolated storms. They were part of the same gathering weather. They had learned from the massacre that silence could be dangerous, that the stories of the powerful would always try to shape reality. So they began to tell their own. Imagine sitting in a New England tavern then, the room warm and dim, the air thick with smoke and whispers. Someone reads aloud a fresh newspaper from Boston, the ink still wet. Every word feels alive. Every pause holds possibility. In that hush, you can almost hear the future forming. A quiet conviction that ordinary men and women could hold history in their hands simply by refusing to forget. Jacquestin Saxaïsou was not a war. It was a story, and stories are what shape nations. It taught the colonies that truth was not always what was declared from thrones, but what was remembered in hearts. That injustice once witnessed could not be unseen, and the unity, born of shared grief, was stronger than any army. So they mourned. They printed, they whispered, and in their whispers, a revolution began to breathe. The calm returned to Boston's streets, but it was a different kind of calm. The stillness before a decision, the hush before the first note of a new song. They didn't yet know what form it would take, but the colonies had found something they had never truly shared before, a common story, And once a people share a story, they are no longer strangers. They are something new. Boston, 1773. The air smelled of salt and smoke and the faint bittersweet scent of tea. Ships from faraway lands sat heavy in the harbor, their sails furled, their decks quiet. And in the town's narrow streets, a slow frustration was steeping, much like the drink that would soon spill into history. The British Crown had long taxed the colonies. Paper, paint, glass, and tea. Small things, but reminders of control. Most taxes had been repealed after the Boston Massacre, but one remained: the tax on tea. To London, it was a symbol of authority. To the colonists, it was a quiet insult, a reminder that even in the smallest cup, they were not free. The Tea Act of 1773 was meant to save the East India Company, struggling beneath its own empire. It allowed the company to ship tea directly to the colonies, skipping middlemen and undercutting local merchants. The price was lower, but the message was clear. You will drink what we send you, and you will pay what we ask. But in the heart of Boston, that simple equation no longer worked. Money was not the issue. Principle was. And principles, once awakened, do not go back to sleep. Meetings began to stir in Faneuil Hall, the great brick marketplace that served as Boston's public heart. Samuel Adams again took the lead, his voice steady, his reasoning sharp. Others joined him: John Hancock, a wealthy merchant whose signature would soon become legend, and hundreds of ordinary townspeople from shipwrights to printers, all drawn together by the same word: liberty. They debated deep into the night. Could they allow the tea to be unloaded? Could they refuse the king's ships? To some, the idea of resistance still felt dangerous, even treasonous. But to others, it was already too late to turn back. Then came December. The winter wind off. The Atlantic carried the scent of something new: decision. 3 ships waited in the harbor: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Their holds were full of tea. For weeks, the cargo sat untouched while Bostonians argued, negotiated, and protested. Governor Thomas Hutchinson insisted the tea be unloaded and the taxes paid. The colonists, through their town meetings, insisted it would not. Neither side would bend. And then, on the evening of December 16th, the decision was made. Thousands gathered at the Old South Meeting House, men and women packed shoulder to shoulder, the flickering candlelight revealing faces pale with anticipation. Voices rose, calm at first, then louder, more certain. Samuel Adams stood and said, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." That sentence hung in the air like a spark. Outside, a murmur began. Men slipped away from the church and into the cold. Some wrapped themselves in blankets and smeared soot upon their faces, not to deceive, but to symbolize. They called themselves Mohawks, invoking the spirit of freedom native to the land itself. From the docks, the sound of boots on wood, a low chant, the groan of ships shifting with the tide. For hours they worked methodically, breaking open 342 chests of tea, one by one, and spilling their contents into the black harbor. The night smelled of salt and bitter leaves, and the smoke of quiet defiance. They harmed no one. They broke nothing else. When the work was done, they swept the decks clean, a curious act of discipline, even reverence. Then they slipped away into the night, silent as they had come. The next morning, the water in Boston Harbor was brown, steeped in rebellion. 1,000 seagulls wheeled overhead, as if the ocean itself was tasting this new thing. Freedom mixed with consequence. To the British Crown, it was vandalism, a direct challenge to order and law. To the colonists, it was something else entirely, the purest expression of self-determination they had ever known. They had not shouted, they had not killed, they had not written a declaration. They had simply said no, and meant it. The world noticed. London answered swiftly, with the coercive acts, what the colonies would soon call the intolerable acts. Boston's port was closed, its trade strangled. British soldiers filled its streets once more, but punishment had a strange effect. Instead of isolating Boston, It united the colonies. Virginia wept for her sister city. New York sent supplies. Letters crisscrossed the continent, words carrying the heat of sympathy and the quiet rhythm of resolve. From that night on, tea was no longer just a drink. It was a memory of courage, of calm defiance, of a people realizing they could act together and survive the storm. Years later, one witness described that night as still and dignified, like a sacrament. No drunkenness, no chaos, only intention, and the faint whisper of something holy, the birth of conscience. Imagine now that harbor under the moon, the tea leaves swirling in the tide, like fragments of old dreams, each leaf a promise, that a new kind of nation might grow from the courage to say enough. The Boston Tea Party was not the beginning of war. It was the moment America realized it could stand upright. And as the ripples spread outward from that harbor, they reached not only the shores of other colonies, but the quiet hearts of people everywhere who had ever felt small beneath the weight of distant power. The night was calm again, but beneath that calm, something irreversible had begun to move. Philadelphia, 1774. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of wax, paper, and horse leather. Outside, the cobbled streets echoed with the rhythm of carriage wheels. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, the building that would later be called Independence Hall, 56 men gathered beneath a shared unease. They came from far-flung colonies, from the green hills of New England, the tobacco fields of Virginia, the plantations of the Carolinas, and the ports of Maryland. Some wore fine coats, others arrived dusty from the road, but they all carried something invisible yet heavy, the burden of representation. For the first time, the colonies had come together not to trade or celebrate, but to decide what kind of people they would be. There was no flag yet, no anthem, no nation, only the fragile beginnings of unity. Among them was George Washington, silent and observant, Patrick Henry, whose voice carried like fire through still air, John Adams, careful and reasoned, and Samuel Adams, the agitator turned strategist. They were not rebels, not yet. Most still prayed for reconciliation, for peace with Britain, if only peace could be honorable. But peace, they were learning, is not always gentle. Sometimes it asks for surrender. Each man spoke his mind. Some called for patience. Give the king time, they said. Others argued that time had already been stolen. For days they debated. They wrote letters to the crown, listing their grievances with careful politeness. They pledged loyalty to King George, even as they condemned his parliament's acts. It was a strange dance, between duty and defiance, between fear and hope. But as the nights passed, something began to change. Men who had arrived as Virginians or New Yorkers or Bostonians began to see themselves for the first time as something more, as Americans. John Adams later wrote that the moment felt like a new world rising. Not of conquest or wealth, but of shared responsibility. Each delegate knew that what they said in that hall might decide the fate of millions yet unborn. Out of their discussions came resolutions, not of violence, but of principle. They agreed to boycott British goods, to form networks of correspondence, to stand together if one of them was attacked. It was not yet war. It was preparation. They called it the Continental Association, a pledge of mutual defense signed by men who had once been strangers. Their unity was not loud. It was patient, like a tide returning to shore. Each word they wrote felt cautious but deliberate. Each signature, a soft defiance against the empire's reach. They closed their meetings with prayer. Even those who disagreed knelt together, because they knew that something larger than politics was being born in that moment. When the Congress finally adjourned, autumn had settled over Philadelphia. The delegates stepped out into a city glowing with candlelight and uncertainty. They did not yet know that in less than a year, shots would be fired at Lexington and Concord. But many could feel it, the slow inevitability of what was coming. Back in their own colonies, They carried with them a different kind of conviction. Not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but a sense of dignity. A belief that if they were to stand alone, they would do so together. Letters began to move again, faster than ever. The committees of correspondence now connected every major town. Pamphlets were printed and passed hand to hand. And for the first time, ordinary farmers, craftsmen, and mothers began to use the word Congress with pride. The idea of unity, once a whisper, was now a melody. A soft one, still fragile, but growing stronger with every passing moon. John Dickinson, a lawyer from Pennsylvania, had written, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." Those words captured the mood, cautious, yearning, certain. But in their hearts, each man knew that reconciliation might be slipping away. Still, they hoped. Hope is a stubborn thing. Soft violin notes, warm and slow. When they parted, some embraced, others simply nodded. The kind of quiet respect that passes between men who have shared the same heavy truth. They left Philadelphia not as revolutionaries, but as caretakers of a possibility. They had planted the first seed of American unity, a small, trembling idea that would one day become a nation. Outside, winter crept closer. The streets emptied. And somewhere in the distance, a lone rider carried a letter northward. Its words simple, its purpose profound. We must stand together or we will surely fall apart. That sentence would echo for years, across valleys, across battles, across generations. And though they did not yet know it, that unity, born of candlelight and compromise, would soon be tested in fire. April 1775. New England slept under a thin veil of mist. The moon hung low, silvering the rooftops of small towns. Concord, Lexington, Monotony, names that would soon echo forever. The air carried a feeling too subtle to name, like the pause before thunder. The British Army had moved quietly for weeks. In Boston, General Thomas Gage received secret orders from London: disperse the rebels, seize their gunpowder, and arrest the troublemakers. John Hancock and Samuel Adams. It was meant to be swift, clean, and unnoticed. But word travels fast when liberty is at stake. Boston's network of riders and lookouts, men and women alike, watched every movement of red coats, every whisper of preparation. On the night of April 18th, 2 lanterns flickered in the tower of Old North Church. It was the signal agreed upon by Paul Revere and his friends, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. The British were crossing the Charles River, and with that, the silent machinery of resistance began to move. Revere rode out into the darkness, the cool wind on his face, shouting softly to every village he passed, "The regulars are coming." Not the British, for they were all, in name, British still, but the regulars, the king's men. At every door he passed, lights flared in windows. Muskets were pulled from above mantles, powder horns filled, boots laced tight. By the time Revere reached Lexington, the town was awake, small fires burning, men gathered with quiet determination. There, in a plain wooden house, slept John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Revere's knock brought them to the door. "The regulars are on the road," he said simply. They did not flee immediately. They prayed, spoke, and waited. Outside, the local militia, farmers, shopkeepers, fathers, stood forming on the green. At dawn, the mist glowed pale around them. Dozens of men, some barely awake, facing the disciplined columns of British soldiers approaching from the east. Major Pitcairn of the British Army called out, "Disperse, ye rebels! Lay down your arms!" For a heartbeat, no one moved. The 2 lines stood, one trained, one trembling, the silence between them wide as the ocean that separated them from London. Then a sound, a shot, sharp, quick, and uncertain. No one ever knew who fired first, but that single sound became the first breath of a revolution. In moments, smoke filled the air. 8 colonists lay dead on the Lexington Green. The rest scattered into the trees, hearts pounding. Muskets clutched tight. The British marched on toward Concord, confident and grim. But the countryside was awake now. Church bells rang in. Every village drums beat from barn to barn. From every hill and field, militiamen gathered, their faces set in quiet resolve. At the North Bridge in Concord, a group of American militiamen stood waiting. They watched as British soldiers began to burn supplies in town, the smoke curling black against the morning sky. Then one farmer turned to another and said the words that have come down through time. "We must stand our ground. We must fire." The shot heard round the world. The exchange was brief, chaos and thunder, smoke and shouting. But when it cleared, the British began to retreat, all the way back to Boston, through forests alive with unseen eyes and hidden gunfire. From behind stone walls and trees, the colonists struck and vanished again. It was not the war they had known before. It was something new, something wilder. By nightfall, the British had lost nearly 300 men. The countryside was alive with a new kind of courage. That night, lanterns glowed in every farmhouse. Mothers whispered prayers. Fathers cleaned muskets by candlelight. Children lay awake, sensing that their world had changed forever. In Boston, General Gage peered from his window toward the dark horizon, where smoke still lingered above the fields. He had thought to quell rebellion. Instead, he had kindled. And the colonies were now past words. The age of petitions had ended. An age of action had begun. But even in the midst of fear, something extraordinary had happened. Ordinary men, farmers, blacksmiths, preachers, had faced the greatest army on earth, and they had not run. And perhaps even more powerful than their muskets was the silence that followed their victory, the stillness of a people realizing, for the first time, that freedom was not granted. It was taken carefully, painfully, one step at a time. As night fell over Lexington and Concord, the air was filled with the faint smell of powder and the sweetness of spring. Owls called again. The river flowed on, indifferent but eternal. And somewhere among the wounded and the watchfires, a quiet voice might have whispered the truth that would carry them through years of war. We are not subjects. We are something new. The spring of 1775 unfolded quietly, as if nature herself were holding her breath. The meadows bloomed, the rivers ran clear, but the world felt changed. In the homes of 13 colonies, people moved with a strange mixture of pride and disbelief, the kind that comes after crossing a line you can never step back over. At first, many still hoped the fighting would fade away. Perhaps the king would relent, they thought. Perhaps Parliament would understand. But even as the letters sailed across the Atlantic, the tone of those letters grew colder, harder, less like a family quarrel and more like a reckoning. In Massachusetts, thousands of militia surrounded Boston, turning the city into a cage. Inside, the British soldiers watched from behind their red coats and bayonets. Outside, farmers and fishermen stood guard, ordinary men shaping the first outlines of an army. They were still called Minutemen, but the world was beginning to call them something else, the beginning of a revolution. In May, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, the same hall, the same men. But the mood was different now. The smell of ink and candle wax mingled with the faint scent of gunpowder carried in by riders from the north. John Hancock took the chair. Benjamin Franklin arrived from London, weary but wise. And Thomas Jefferson, young and quiet, took his seat for the first time, a mind full of words that would soon change the world. There was still no talk of independence, not yet. Only of defense, of how to protect what had already begun. So they did something daring in its simplicity. They created a continental army. The choice of who would lead it was delicate. The war had started in Massachusetts, but this could not be a New England cause. It had to belong to all. And so, after long days of debate, they turned their eyes toward the tall, reserved Virginian who had sat mostly in silence, George Washington. He rose to speak only briefly. His words were humble. He accepted the post with the utmost diffidence, but his calm presence carried weight beyond the room. In his quiet way, he embodied what America was becoming, reluctant to fight, yet unwilling to bow. In June, news arrived from Massachusetts. A hilltop battle that would shake the confidence of an empire. Bunker Hill. The colonists had taken position above the city, digging trenches into the rocky soil. The British advanced 3 times, red lines moving, up the slope, and twice they were thrown back by gunfire. Only when the Patriots' powder ran out did the line break. The British won the hill, but at a terrible cost. Hundreds dead or wounded, the air thick with the smell of smoke and disbelief. The colonists lost the ground, but gained something greater. The knowledge that the might of Britain could bleed. That summer, George Washington rode north to take command of his new army. He found them ragged, disorganized, a collection of volunteers in mismatched clothes. But he looked upon them with steady eyes and saw potential. He began to drill them, to teach them discipline, not of tyranny, but of unity. Each morning, drums beat across the camps outside Boston. Each evening, prayers rose with the smoke of cooking fires. They were learning what it meant to be soldiers of a cause, not of a king. And in every colony, whispers grew louder. If the king would not listen, then perhaps it was time to stop calling him king. Pamphlets spread like wildfire. Among them, one voice carried above the rest. A recent immigrant from England named Thomas Paine. His little booklet, Common Sense, appeared in January 1776. Its words were simple, direct, unflinching. That monarchy was an absurdity, that freedom was a natural right, and that America was destined to stand on its own. In taverns and churches, on porches and along roads, people read those words aloud. They nodded, they argued, they wept. Something inside them shifted. They were no longer colonists seeking redress. They were a people seeking identity. Even the cautious began to feel it, the pull of inevitability. To resist now would be to deny the truth written in every heart. Across the ocean, the king's patience snapped. He declared the colonies in open rebellion and sent more troops. Warships gathered along the coast, prisons filled. The Atlantic itself seemed smaller now, its waves carrying not commerce but conflict. And yet in that tightening noose, the colonies found their voice. In June of 1776, as summer ripened once more, a committee was chosen to write something that had never before existed. A declaration not of loyalty, but of separation. Thomas Jefferson took up his pen. He sat by candlelight, the windows of Philadelphia open to the humid night. Outside, crickets sang. Inside, he wrote, when in the course of human events, words that flowed like prayer, soft yet thunderous in meaning. He wrote of equality, of rights, of the pursuit of happiness, concepts that seemed almost too large for the time and yet perfectly sized for the dream that was forming. By July, those words were read aloud to the Congress. They debated, revised, argued. Then, on the 4th of July, 1776, they adopted them. The Declaration of Independence was signed, not as an act of defiance alone, but of faith. Faith that a group of ordinary people could govern themselves, that reason and liberty could live, side by side, that the world could be remade through ideas. And though the ink was still wet, the men who signed knew it might also be their death warrant. If they failed, they would hang. But they signed anyway, each stroke of the pen a quiet heartbeat of courage. Outside, the city went about its life. Children played, merchants sold bread. The world had not yet caught up to what had happened inside that hall. But somewhere, deep in the collective soul of the colonies, a bell began to ring. Not in metal, but in meaning. The colonies were gone. In their place, a nation had begun to awaken. And though war would rage for years more, though heartbreak and loss would follow, the direction was now certain. The dawn of independence had broken, and in its quiet light, a new world waited to be born. The war that followed the Declaration of Independence was not swift, nor was it glorious. It was long, cold, uncertain, the kind of struggle that tests both the body and the spirit. The men who signed the parchment in Philadelphia soon found themselves scattered, some leading armies, some hiding from British patrols, some mourning the loss of homes and families. In the winter camps, The soldiers endured hunger and disease. Their shoes wore thin, their coats tattered. Frost bit through their fingers as they clutched their muskets. And yet through the cold mist they held fast to something invisible, a belief that the pain would mean something. At Valley Forge, the snow turned crimson beneath their feet. Washington walked among them silently, his breath visible in the frozen air, his presence alone a kind of warmth. He prayed in the woods, not for victory, but for endurance, that his men might keep going one more day, and then another and another. While the army suffered, life at home grew no easier. Families rationed food. Children waited for fathers who never came back. And yet, in small towns and distant farms, the idea of liberty spread like a quiet fire. It was carried in letters, in prayers, in whispered songs sung by candlelight. It lived in the heart of enslaved people who heard the words, "All men are created equal," and wondered if freedom could truly mean everyone. It lived in the courage of women who tilled the fields and mended uniforms, who refused to let the dream die. The revolution was not fought only on battlefields. It was fought in the silence of resolve, in the will to wake each morning and believe that something better could still be born from ruin. As years passed, tides turned. The British, once certain of victory, grew weary. The colonies, once disjointed, found unity. And through the help of allies from distant lands, France most of all, in 1781, in a small Virginia town called Yorktown, the end began to take shape. Washington's army, joined by French troops and ships, surrounded the British under General Cornwallis. For weeks, cannon fire thundered across the hills. Smoke rose over the fields. And then, one quiet October morning, the guns stopped. Cornwallis surrendered. The fighting, for all practical purpose, was done. When the news reached Philadelphia, the city erupted in joy. Church bells rang. People wept in the streets. Yet for many, the joy was tinged with disbelief. After years of fear, hunger, and death, it was hard to imagine peace. In taverns and homes, people whispered a question that had no easy answer. Now what? Peace came slowly. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially recognizing the United States of America. But the ink could not mend the fractures that war had left behind. There were debts to pay, wounds to heal, and a government to build. Freedom, they discovered, was not a single victory. It was a lifetime of labor. The new nation faced chaos, arguments over power, disputes between states, and the ever-present shadow of slavery. A contradiction that would linger painfully for generations. George Washington, weary but resolute, returned to his farm at Mount Vernon. He longed for the quiet life he had left behind, but the nation called him back once more. This time not to lead an army, but to lead a people. In 1789, he became the first president of the United States. And when he stood on the balcony in New York City to take the oath, the wind lifted the corner of his sleeve, and the world seemed to exhale. Under his hand, the fragile experiment began. A republic built on the idea that government could spring from consent, not command. It was imperfect, it was uncertain, but it was real. The founding fathers, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Hamilton, debated and dreamed in letters and pamphlets, shaping the bones of a nation from the echoes of revolution. And beneath it all, the people, the farmers, the blacksmiths, the seamstresses, the freed and the enslaved, continued the true work of liberty. To live, to build, to believe. Years passed. Cities rose. Rivers carried new trade. Children grew up never knowing the rule of a king. But in the quiet hours, the hours just before dawn, when the wind moved softly through the trees, there was still the memory of what it had cost. The graves on distant hillsides, the tears of mothers, the long winters of waiting, freedom. It turned out was not a flag waving in the sun. It was a whisper in the dark, a promise made and remade every generation, faint melody of a fife, tender and slow. And though the years would bring more trials, wars, divisions, reckonings, yet to come, the seed planted in that fragile time continued to grow. From rebellion had come a republic. From colonies, a country. And from ordinary men and women, a legend of extraordinary endurance. History would remember the battles, the speeches, the declarations. But behind them all was something quieter. The resolve of a people who refused to live without dignity. When you walk today through the old fields of Concord, through the cobbled streets of Philadelphia, or the green hills of Virginia, you can still feel it. A kind of stillness that hums beneath the noise of modern life. Ita is the stillness of beginning, the echo of a world deciding to exist. The revolution did not end when the guns fell silent. It lives in the questions each generation must ask again. What does freedom mean? Who is it for? And how do we keep it alive? Not in monuments or words, but in kindness, in fairness, in hope. And so, as the night deepens and the story comes to rest, imagine the world as it was then. A quiet country, uncertain yet unbroken, its stars just beginning to shine. The road from rebellion had been long, but at last, a nation had found its. This is how America began, not in triumph but in courage, not in noise but in a whisper that still echoes, we the people.